Chapter 41. The Door to the Underworld. "The devil himself wouldn't keep in with you," his father said as he arrived puffing at Carrickboy. Used to homemade bone shakers, he was amazed at the freedom of his new bike. He thought of the times he cycled the length and breadth of the parish on bikes that didn't deserve to be called such. They weren't as bad as the buns, though. In truth, his was the last straw, literally. Though it was hard to believe it could be done, he hadn't bought an inner tube for his high Nelly for a lifetime. Stuffed with hay or straw, or best of all, reeds from the loch at St. Shinnock's Lake, he sallied forth to the mart at Ballymahon, or even further afield, as if it were the ride of a lifetime. The dying embers of a woodbine clutched between his thin lips. Not given to verbosity, as grandfather often remarked, he nevertheless managed to be quite entertaining and a fair hand to tell a story as well. High winds, rain, sleet or snow prevented him from going about his daily chores. His daily meal consisted of bread and jam, nothing more. Seamie watched his movements like a hawk as he passed away while delivering telegrams to the four corners of the wind. Though Tess's thatch was porous enough, the buns was another story entirely. The age-old rafters stood out like the bones of a skeleton through the wafer-thin thatch, and hadn't been touched since his brother passed away some years earlier. It was hard to know if it was laziness or lack of interest. When the woodworm-infested rafters finally gave up the ghost, he simply cleaned out the cowshed and moved in. It served him well for a few years more, until it finally succumbed to neglect and fell in like the rest. "It was lucky I was coming out counting," he related later while chatting to a farmer from Tunlegee, the back of the Wind. He didn't tell him that he had never had more than 2 or 3 animals, but that was an unnecessary detail and not crucial to the overall effect of the story. When asked how he coped with the loss, he replied that he put the chickens out of their house and moved in there. "And what happened to the chickens?" he was asked. Sure, they went up in the rafters. What else would they do?" he replied as nonchalantly as if it were an everyday occurrence. It was well rumoured that a tea chest of cash was found buried under the collapsed roof after the brother passed away. No one knew what became of the money, other than the fact that a few calves appeared around the place and a field dividing the 2 tiny farms was bought. Although an obvious and logical development, it was said to be the dearest field in the parish because the owner, another neighbour of the same name, who was renowned for his tightness, held out for the last shilling. The bun didn't care. Money meant nothing to him. Some said he was easily relieved of it by one crook or another. Despite his apparent miserable existence, he seemed as happy as Larry as he hopped off his bike to chat with his neighbours and a few friends he trusted. He didn't have many because he had been bitten too often. Bill Newman, a true friend if ever there was one, owned a nice farm of land directly across the road from the buns. It boasted a series of good springs that were said to come from St. Shinnock's Lake over by the Mass Rock. Tradition told of an underground lake, or, more likely, an underground river that was said to follow a course from the mountain between Maidu and Arda to Abbeyshrule bog and on to Cunnacanore, the Hill of Gold on the Westmeath border. Bill often called to see the bun, but they were more likely to meet in the Nuggets in Ballinamana, the town of the monks, than anywhere. There they would join up with the cuddy, the potstick, the hearse and the fiddler to while the evening away with all kinds of tall tales and storytelling. The cuddy's ghost stories grew wilder and wilder, and his captive audience bigger and bigger, until it was suggested an extension be built to accommodate them. The fact that a cracking little she-bean grew up around them may have preempted its construction. The narrow forms gave way to sugans and 3-legged stools, while the all too powerful putcheen was replaced by Jemieson's redbreast and crested ten. The hearse nearly brought the house down when he launched into an extravagant story about the double-breasted prostitutes beyond in Athlone. "How do you make that out?" was all grandfather could say, as tears rolled down his ruddy cheeks. "Sure, it was the clothes they wore. What else do you think?" the hearse continued, as his gobsmacked listeners doubled up with the laughter. "I suppose you mean they were wearing double-breasted waistcoats," the potstick ventured, unable to control his mirth. "Not a bit of it, boys. They were walking two abreast. That's all," was his parting sally, as he dived for the door to escape the good-natured banter that flew after him. It was a pet day. The sun was cracking the stones as Seamie pedalled past Lisnacreeva boarding towards Commonses Cross. Word was out that the banshee was heard near the lane a few nights beforehand, but they weren't sure if it was the Cashel one that had gone astray or the one that normally hung around Belton's crossroads. Peddling past Maguire's Lane, he spotted the bun sneaking along the far hedge. Curious, he alighted immediately, parked Betsy safely out of sight, and ducked back to the boreen, making sure to keep him in sight as he moved quickly along the thick hedge that divided them. Sensing he was either after something or up to something, he wasn't about to miss anything. Either way, he wanted to be party to the proceedings. It soon became clear that he wasn't hunting. His deportment demonstrated a certain furtiveness and fear of being watched or followed. Despite his youthful years, he was well used to being able to conceal himself when the need arose. After all, he had managed to keep secret his hiding place under the big bull tree beside the school up to the present. No mean feat when you consider hundreds of kids passed away daily. Unaware of his presence, the bun eased through the thick hedge and continued towards the fairy lists at the border. And given a wide berth by even the most experienced hunters due to its deep and dangerous marshy surrounds, it had a little island in the centre in which a fine liss stood out in splendid isolation. Even Muniz kept clear of it on his odd visit to that outreach of his empire. There was nothing to entice him inside either, because access was almost impossible due to the marshy ground that surrounded it. The bun obviously had no such fears, as Seamie watched him pick his steps in a zigzag manner that kept his feet dry and brought him safely to the outer perimeter of the liss. Taking careful note of his steps, he crept ever closer, keeping cover between the two of them. He was certain now he had something to hide, or was about to do so. His curiosity rightly aroused, he had no problem following, as the imprint of the bun's wellies showed clearly in the soft lichen. Advancing step by step, he placed each foot carefully in that of his quarry, noting that although the top layer was spongy, it was obvious there was a sound base underneath. He had just reached the safety of the raised bank when a litany of muffled curses forced him to lie low. Scrambling up to the dense underground, he managed to keep himself concealed while keeping the bun in full view. He was attempting to clear thick thorny briars from a cluster of rocks in front of him, but it was obvious he wasn't having much success. That particular type of briar was notorious for extracting blood, and as far as Seamie was concerned, the blasted thing seemed possessed. His terrorizing encounter with his first cousin in the glade came quickly to mind as he thought of the dark night. It frightened two souls out of him as it attached itself to his coat sleeve, leaving him thinking it was an evil spirit trying to take him to hell with it. The memory held fresh with him as he held his position and saw the bun break a thick stick to help him with his labour. Mistake number 2, he thought, as he remembered Tess' advice. Don't ever break a bough or branch, a din, a liss. deeply conscious of that as he went about his tours of the 10 townlands. He knew spurs were still stalking their old hunting grounds and would resent all intrusions from any but the little folk. Wielding the broken branch as if it were a sword or axe, the bun lay into the dense clump of briars with gusto. Suddenly he was crying out in pain as a thick bramble recoiled and dug deep into his unprotected wrist. He let out a sharp, short cry as he jumped back, blood flowing freely from an open wound. "I had a curse of Christ on ye," he swore as he dropped the branch and tried to stem the flow. Stumbling back, he fell heavily, banging his head on a stumpy bush as he did so. Though his situation was delicate, Seamie knew he couldn't leave him like that. He'd explain his presence later, but for the moment he'd have to risk that rather than leave him in obvious danger. "I was after rabbits, Brian, when I heard a voice and came in to investigate." He lied. It was obvious he was more than surprised to see the youth, but as he was losing blood quickly, he accepted the youth's help. Putting his jacket under his head while tearing the sleeve off his shirt, he searched round frantically for a good bunch of lichen. Using the top part only and making sure to keep the soil from it, he covered the wounded area and tied the torn shirt sleeve around the lot. According to Tess, the lichen would work fast and protect the affected area. He had gone very quiet and was as white as a ghost as Seamie squeezed a little water from a handful of lichen he had dipped into a pool beside them. A gentle shaking soon saw the blood return to his ashen face. He was over the worst now, Seamie felt, but he'd have to get him out of there as quickly as possible. A hardy hooer, as the locals used to say. He was soon struggling to his feet. Handing him the stick to steady himself, Seamie offered his shoulder, but it was clear he was coming round when he declined. Tightening the baling twine around his waist, he shook his head as he steadied himself. "Them cursed briars are possessed," he said as he stepped gingerly back along the tracks. "Don't bother talking now, Brian," Seamie urged as they walked back slowly towards his shanty. Pointing to where he kept the key hidden behind a loose stone in the gable end, Seamie withdrew it gingerly and opened the door. Anyone with a mind to do so would have walked through the same door as if it were paper, but that was neither here nor there, he thought, as he eased him into the only chair in the little room. Heaps of dry tinder and clippings lay in bundles at the corner near the open hearth. Being well used to lighting Tess's fire, Seamie had a good one going in jig time. The kettle was soon singing as he prepared a jar of tea for him. "You're a queer hawk, lad," the bun smiled as he blew on the tea. Needless to say, there was neither milk nor sugar, nor did it make a bit of differ to either of them as they supped from the 2 jam jars. "Who'd want mugs?" Seamie joked as he thought of the value of the jars. Although he had never been in the shanty before, he correctly deduced how he coped with the nocturnal visitors in search of something to eat. Lines of jam jars stood shoulder to shoulder on the makeshift mantelpiece over the fireplace. Rodents and the like would have to venture further afield in search of supper, he suggested, as he showed him how he kept the batch loaf safe as well. Concealed in thick brown paper, it was completely safe inside a biscuit tin that was the usual present given by Heward every Christmas. "Indeed, I saw the Hoors nibbling at it, but it's got the better of them so far, Vic. You couldn't be up to them, though. They'd mind mice on the crossroads, they would." Seamie laughed with him, as he felt he was well on the road to recovery by now, and was at ease with his presence. Time had told him that if he kept his counsel, people would trust him. It always worked. Everyone knew he could be trusted to keep his mouth shut if it wasn't going to harm anyone by doing so. There were secrets, and there were secrets. Some didn't deserve to be called such, but others... "I'd better tell you what I was up to, Seamie," he began. "That's your business, Brian," he said as he pretended not to be unduly interested. "There's not much you don't know, child, and I know for sure you'll keep it to yourself. Tess told me the devil wouldn't get news out of you if you didn't want to tell him." he continued. Well, it lets people trust me and gets me to places where few other youngsters get to go, he ventured as he saw him preparing to tell his story. Them Lisses and Forts have more to tell than most, he said as he lit one woodbine from the ashes of another. The Maguires are here as long, if not longer, than most of the people in the parish. It's said that we came out of the caves beyond in the commons, and maybe that's true. But a lot seem to have come out of there as well. It's said that my great-great-grandfather was hiding out with a group of rebels after Sarsfield and St. Ruth had nearly freed the country from that bastard Willie the Orangeman. St. Ruth, the bollocks, lost his head in Athlone through not trusting Sarsfield, and it was all downhill after that. Any of them that were able to fight and run and keep at it until they made it to the safety of the marshes and bogs around Abbeyshrule did so. They were helped by their own, of course, lying low until the Dutch murderers gave up and went their way after riches and spoils further south. The lowlands of Longford offered little to them, although many's a settler from Cromwell to King Billy found nice ground here too. Indeed, they're still here, though they're as Irish as ourselves by now. He nodded as he warmed to his story. That same fort over there has hidden many's a secret down the years, Vic. Priests and parishioners hid there during the worst of times. There was a fair-sized cave there all the time, but what they didn't know was that the mad Maguire had found another cave leading off the small front one and kept it to himself until he was on his deathbed. He passed on the secret to his son, who was my grandfather. The secret was passed from father to son until now. Now that there's only myself left, I was thinking of telling Tess, but sure, as you know her better than myself, I might as well tell you, or the secret will die with me. They say you should never bring a secret to the grave with you, or your soul will be tortured with it forever. Now, I don't know if that's true or not, but I don't want to take a chance in it either, Seamie. I'm sure a sixpence you'll mind the secret well until you know what to do with it. I mind the time my father brought me there the first time. You'd never think there was a cave there at all. It was that well hidden. It's hard to say how they stumbled on it, but it was a long, long time ago. I think it might have been in my grandfather's time when one of the other Maguires, no relation, was caught stalking the place. He disappeared overnight and was never seen again. That wasn't unusual around here then or now. You know full well about the Mulveys beyond Entomb. I'm sure Tess will have told you about their gossin. That wasn't the full shilling. He went missing too, but no one knew what happened. They said he died very young and was buried in Tuxinad. Others said they'd hear cries around the house in the middle of the night. Some said it was a banshee, but it was years later when your own father, a great man to tell when a cow was due to calve, was passing when Mulvey called him to check a young heifer that was near her time. Rex gave his verdict that it'd be another day at least, and was ready to leave when Father Pat pulled up in the very Volkswagen that had chopped the finger of Mulvey a week earlier. He marched in past him without as much as "How do you do?" Your father asked Mulvey if anything was wrong, but was as wise going out the gate as he was coming in. "What do you think happened, Brian?" Seamie asked, more by way of keeping him going than anything else now that he had him in full swing. "Well, it didn't take your father too long to find out. Sure, he knows everyone in the parish and has a fair hand at ferreting things out, as you know full well. He kept digging and pulling until old Mulvey in Ballintubber told him about the gossoon that never died. That put the ferule on it altogether. It turned out in the long run that the child who was supposed to have died never died at all. He was locked into a small room for years and never got out again, as far as anyone around knows. The PP knew, of course, and called every now and then when the child was not well or acting up. It's another strange case, but sure the place is full of strange cases, Seamie, as you well know. Agreeing with him, there were a lot of unanswered questions. He wanted to know more about Mulvey's finger and the parish priest's Volkswagen. Well, child, Father Pat was having a bit of bother with his car and got Mulvey to have a look at it. He was too bloody miserable to bring it to a proper mechanic. Not that Mulvey wasn't handy enough at an engine, and he having to keep trucks and tractors going day and night. If it wasn't for the new machinery John Joe and the father kept into him, he'd have to give up altogether. The pull of money that they got from Argentina didn't last jig time with the abuse they gave it. Some said they got thousands, but sure we'll never know. It kept half the parish from going thirsty for a good while. What they didn't drink, they invested, and like many's the bad investment, when it's in the wrong hands, it loses its value instead of making it. The machinery kept their slate clean and Mulvey's for nearly a year, until the well went dry. There was nothing for it then, only the old tractor, but that soon bit the dust as well. The new tractor they bought wasn't in their names at all, as the bloody Egypt left Mulvey to organise it for them. What else would he do but put it into one of his own lads' names? Anyway, wasn't the PP sitting in out of the cold when Mulvey asked him to be ready to turn the engine when he shouted at him? The wind was high and the priest a bit deaf as well, so he had to shout at him several times not to turn the key until he told him. Well, they got their messages mixed up, and the next thing, the top of Mulvey's finger was flying faster than a feckin' fan. The curses and swears of Mulvey would light candles beyond an Edgertown. Out jumps the PP and orders him into the car and straight over to the McGivney. The doctor took one look at the top of his finger and flung it into the field, saying it wasn't much use before, and it wasn't going to be any use from now on either. Maybe he should have checked with the women of the parish first, but we let that sit, as Tess says. Divil the likes of the row that started then, Seamie. But the PP and the doctor got into it fairly lively then, ordering them into the field to find the finger because it'd have to be buried in holy ground. The PP wouldn't budge an inch. McGivney told him if he could jump the quick any better than the excuse of a horse he had was after buying, then he might come out and help to find Mulvey's finger. Pat Carrigy was pretending to be topping the quick beside him, but about as busy as a butcher during Lent. He spotted McGivney picking up a lugworm, pretending it was the finger. He took it inside and dressed it up a bit and put it in a tin box where he kept needles and the like. Handing it to Mulvey, he told him to take it with him and the priest as well, and not to let it out of his sight until it was blessed and buried. Mulvey didn't need to be reminded, because he knew their form too well and knew they'd stay at it till the cows came home if he didn't sort them out. They'd be still at it if he hadn't separated the two of them. He had to go up the north to get butter and stuff that very next day and didn't want to waste another minute. Once Carrigy took the wing and verified the find, the priest was happy. Carrigy knew how to keep his mouth shut when there was a chance of a shilling. He didn't lie either, because all he agreed to was that the doctor had made a find. It didn't matter to him if it were a stick or an onion, as that wasn't the question he was asked. Mulvey had the car running anyway, so the PP had to jump in or he'd be left standing. They were arguing the toss the whole way to the border, but sure, the time flew with the way they were planning to hobble the doctor's horse at the upcoming gymkhana. 2 better thieves you wouldn't get if you walked the 7 parishes, the bun told him as he poured boiling water onto the tea leaves in his glass mug. Happy, too, that he had talked himself better, he forgot all about the briar that nearly drained every drop of blood that was in him. Tess told Seamie later that his blood was so thin she had to put him on a feed of nettles and watercress to build him up a bit. Although anxious to leave as the evening was getting on, he still wanted to hear or to find out about the cave and where the other Maguire disappeared to. The bun had enough of it, though, and was off with the fairies after the tea and the bread and jam. Pulling the door after him as he left, he advised the bun to take it easy for a few days to build up his strength again. There'd be lots of time for the story about the cave now that he had his confidence. He was getting over the Bullfield gate when he spotted the bun standing on the spudstone, about him to launch himself on his flying machine down the hill towards Tess' palace. Rattling the gate rather than frighten him, he smiled as the old man stepped off the stone. "There you are, the very man I was looking for," the bun said as he composed himself by leaning over the handlebars. "Do you mind the time you saved me bacon beyond in the fairy fort?" he asked. "I do indeed, Brian," he replied, as he sat on the spudstone, hoping he was going to hear more about the bun's forefathers. "As I was about to tell you that time before I fell asleep, the secret of the second cave was passed down through the generations. That's all they knew about it, that there was a second cave. They said the first person into it would die a bad dog's death, so that kept people from going near it. As well as that, the memory of the zigzag path that led over the marsh to the fort was lost. A couple of the commoners made a half-hearted shot at it, but soon gave up as they began to sink into the marsh. I heard Muniz calling it a marsh, or a quagmire, as he was an educated man and he knew big words like that. All Muniz ever wanted was a good feed above him Wynn's Hotel and an armful of women after that. And sure, maybe he was right. He had a way with women and a way with money, and sure, one beggars the other, if you know what I mean. He winked conspiratorially. Anyway, wasn't I at in with Tess one time when we were younger, when I upped and told her about the whole damn thing? "Why didn't you say that to me long ago?" she said. Well, the upshot of it all was that she had heard us said that there was a stone with a map engraved on it somewhere not far from the fort. It took me ages to find the moss, because the moss had grown on it over the years. I kind of thought as much, because I had inspected nearly every fair-sized stone in the fields around the fort. I was of the opinion it might be a flat stone, as them boys were no idiots way back then. Bit by bit, I worked my way back to a flat stone just inside the little boarding leading past the fort, and there it was. No sooner had I peeled off the moss and cleaned it as well as I could than I started to see signs and lines. I took my time at it, because you can't be rushing these things, as you well know. You being who you are and all that. Tesson wasn't far off when she said you'd mind mice at the crossroads, and I'm not being a bit disrespectful either. Well, there it was, and there I was, and what do you think I did then? Not an easy answer, I know, but didn't I look for another flat stone and put it on top of it in case anyone would be passing the boring and spot it? Sure, I don't think anyone went that way but myself, but you never know these days, Vic. There's whoers as is going the road day and night, and you mightn't be asking them their business, because it said that they'd stick a knife in you as quick as look at you. Didn't Sandy lose a bundle just a short while ago, and he out at the back in the wagon, filling a few drums of oil? They were watching him for sure. Well, in they went and lifted his wallet out of his coat pocket and cleaned the till as well. 'Tis said it was the blue doer whore, but it might as well be idle, as they cut straight across the fields without a sinner seeing them. As I was saying before you stopped me— No, you didn't stop me. I stopped myself. Sorry about that. I took my time at it, and before that summer was out, I had it figured. Up I went to Tess and showed her the map I had drawn. I was very careful not to make a dog's dinner of it, and drew it as good as any man could, not leaving out a dot. Now, Tess, as you know, is a fierce, clever woman, and she had it figured out in a flash. I felt like the gawk when I saw what she was after doing. Didn't she turn the map upside down, and by joining in dots and lines, wasn't it as clear as daylight, even to an Amadon like myself. We agreed to meet soon after to explore whatever there was to explore, and we left it at that. A few days later, as the dawn chorus broke, she slipped out the front door, rounded the corner of her house, and checked the coast was clear before easing through the tubular bars at Jordan's Crossroads. At the slightest sound of a bike or tractor, she faded into the hedges as only she could. As hard found as a robin's nest, she melted into nature because she was part of it. Along by the deep drain, she could move rapidly because the few houses in Balnamana were hidden from view. She heard Mad Maggie rousing the cuddy, but knew there was no chance to be heard or seen as she hurried past the Bucks and on past Maguire's Lane until she stood in the Bunn's yard. A wisp of smoke told her he was up about and ready for her. "Come in, girl, the kettle's boiling. We'll have a mouthful before we set off." "All right, so, Brian, we might as well. God knows when we might drink another sup," she said as she blessed herself at the thought of the strange adventure that lay in front of them. Close as she was to nature, her experience of the underworld was limited to the odd encounter with the fairies and leprechauns as she wandered far and wide through the countryside. There weren't many she'd bother with, but there were a few good men that had stopped for a chat once in a while, and if the day was good and no one was in any particular hurry, they'd sit on the bridge until the tales were told and it was time for tea. They knew, and she knew too, that to rush away after a decent chat wasn't the right thing to do. Manners being manners, they'd time it so the tea was part of the overall visit. They often talked about the other world, and of the few who got there, more by chance than anything else. Yes, she was aware of people living long past their natural, but whether they knew they'd passed through the portal or not was a different story. She had a feeling she was close to that point too, because her dreams were full of it lately. "A grand bit of toast, Brian." Sure, you can't beat Flynn's bread or McNamee's either. It's lovely with a bit of jam or marmalade." "Well, I suppose we'd better be going so before the rest of the world is out and about. We could do worse, girl. What they don't know won't trouble them. What have you in the bag?" she asked as they closed the door behind them. "Just a few things we might need if we get into any bother. I brought the small bill hook, a rope, a good torch, and a few bits and pieces." "Better sure nor sorry, Brian. You did right. I brought a few sandwiches in case we were detained longer than we expect." "Come on round the house for a minute, Tess, till I show you something," he said as he led her along a path he had recently cut through a thicket of nettles, thistles, and bushes. Using the bill hook, he cleared a section around a flat stone, and then, with the sharp blade, he removed the moss and fungus until a hexagonal symbol was clearly visible. His Uncle Pat was the first to engrave the stone so that the secret wouldn't be lost completely, and hid it in a way it wouldn't be easily uncovered. That happened after an exceptionally dry summer exposed the stone paths that seemed to wander aimlessly from Billy to Jack. It was far from that. The lines were formal and connected at crisscross angles, an obvious ruse to confuse the curious. As soon as he came across the stone, he covered with another flat one so that it wouldn't be too obvious. Sometime later, when he felt the time was right, he hoisted it into his wheelbarrow and half hid it in brambles behind the house where he lived now. Close as she was to nature, her experience with the underworld was limited to the odd encounter with the fairies and leprechauns. She learned much, but there was much to learn. She knew time wasn't exactly on her side. Yes, she was aware of people living long past their natural lives, but they had no idea how close they were to go through that portal. "We slipped over the fields to the rath before there was a thrush stirring." She had it all in her mind, and we hadn't to look at the map once. She skipped across that hidden pathway like a fairy, and me doing my best to keep on into her. I barely mind, but she could pick the best of them, and her only a girlie. A pure hoor to go, as the fella said. I fancied her myself, but sure, I wasn't at the races with all those dandies around. She told me later she wouldn't lift her hand, never mind her skirt, for the most of them. She knew what she wanted and knew how to get it. That was the way with her, but you know that yourself, child. Anyway, there we were inside the Rath, and before you could say, kiss me arse, wasn't she after slipping inside the twin rocks and gone on me? Divil the likes of it you ever saw. She left me stewing for a few minutes before she eased the rock back the same as if it was a door. Sitting on an axis it was, and easier to move than a well-oiled door if you know how to use it. Well, in we went, and she having the lamp lit and all. There wasn't a bit of fear on her, even though a few bats flew past us. It was lucky we had the lamp, or we wouldn't have seen the drop and would have ended up in a heap with bones broken as well. Didn't the passageway drop under the river and up again the other side? You would have swept all before it in winter if you didn't know where you were going. Several hollowed-out ledges led up and down, and by putting your feet in them and leaning over to the other side, you could stay bone dry. Clever hawks, those that even then knew how to build it. On we went a bit more until it opened out into a bigger room like a cave, as dry as my mouth was just then. There were old ship boxes all around the place, and weapons standing up against the side walls too. I never saw the likes before, but those were pikes for fighting with, the same as they used long ago in Ballinalock and Wexford too, I heard. There were old blunderbusses and traps that had catch a bear, never mind a man. The strange thing was, there were fairly new guns and rounds of ammo as well, which we decided must have been left there by the Ira. There's not much those boys don't know, and a better hiding place couldn't be got in a month's march. Tess told me to keep my mouth shut, but she needn't have bothered, as my mouth is like a clamp when it's no business of my own. The lamp was nearly out, so we hightailed it back as fast as we could, and just in time too, as it gave out as we reached the swinging stone. Either way, it was a huge mystery, and one that needed more thought and careful planning, she told the bun, as they decided they had gone far enough for now. She'd have to have a chat with the fairies herself before venturing into their secret world. She knew exactly who she was going to talk to before she'd take another step into this holy of holies, the one and only Father McCabe, of course. He often wanted to go back, he said, but he was afraid the boys might be there and make him pay for his curiosity. He did go back soon after the brother dying because he had to hide a few things belonging to him. Gobsmacked by the story, and even more so by the thought that a man that seemed to be a miser to the world was exactly the opposite. He could only admire his attitude to life and the hereafter. The more he thought of it, the more he realized how little an influence the church had on its so-called devotees. People like Tess, the Bun, the Nugget, Babs and their peers knew how to live and make their peace with their own God. Though they attended the sacraments, it was more for a peaceful life than anything else. They had seen far too much hypocrisy from the powers that be to pass the slightest bit of heed on them. It was their way, and who was to question that, he thought to himself as the bun poured another mouthful into his jam jar. Though anxious to get home, he didn't wish to offend him, especially after all he had just heard. "There's more to it, Seamie," he said suddenly, as he poked at the dying embers in the fire. Asking him to hold on a minute, Seamie ran out to the lean-to by the house and got an armful of sticks that would keep the fire going for the evening and into the night if it turned cold. Stacking them neatly in the corner by the hearth, he threw a few on the still-lit coals. It wasn't long until the flames were leaping merrily and sparks were spitting like wildcats. The Bunn's house wouldn't hold a candle to Tess's in terms of heat retention because the roof was of galvanized iron with no insulation underneath. The rafters were of untreated timber that had a short shelf life due to the insects that had made mincemeal out of it while you'd be saying the trimmings. Sorry, Brian, go on with your story, he said, knowing there was more and probably better to come. Right so, he grinned as he eased himself back into his old armchair, which groaned like a bad ass under his weight. Reminding himself to give that chair a miss, Seamie put a board on top of the big pot and sat back against the hob. As I was saying, he went on, the biggest surprise was when I looked for a spot to hide the brother's few bob. He then proceeded to tell Seamie that when tapping for a weak spot in the wall, he nearly fell out of his standing when it suddenly caved in, exposing another finely worked tunnel leading away into the darkness. Fearing he might be caught, he decided to shore it up until he had a chat with Tess and maybe explore it another time with her. He took great care to move the pikes before propping them up to conceal his handiwork. That done, he smoothed everything over, making sure there were no obvious footprints. Satisfied that it would hold up, he beat a path home as fast as possible, lest anyone should be out doing the counting or hunting.